Thanks. So I get to talk about water, which is very fun. Deciding which thing to focus on was a little hard. You won't see a single picture of dams today, but come visit me sometime if you're interested into dams or uninto dams, come talk to me. I chose today to talk a little bit about the right to water, partially because all of you were exposed to some of those ideas in the Bottlemania book. And because it's also part of a much bigger discussion in a whole range of areas. Those of you who were here this weekend for the food conference may have heard people talking about a rights-based approach to food. And that concept of a rights-based approach has been very dominant in the sort of the water conversations at the local to the international level. So I wanted to give people an idea of what it was. If there's something that's not clear as I'm talking, feel free to ask questions. I'm hopefully will get done with enough time at the end. So if people have specific questions, either about what I say or about the readings, please ask. I've got a vial here that I brought that has Ganges River water that somebody actually in a boat. I was in a boat in the middle of the Ganges when somebody sold me this, and I filled it full of Ganges River water. And thinking about water, I mean, Don Cass talked about what this thing is. And he talked about it in terms of H2O and what that abstraction may mean. Other people might think about this as part of a god that I've taken from its place and put in this little brass thing and brought back to Bar Harbor. Other people may think about it in terms of stories. It even gets more complicated when you start talking about the meaning of water. And that question, and I traveled in India for 2 months specifically trying to understand that question. You'll see some of that reflected in the talk today. But that meaning of water, meaning is about relationships and sort of our relationship to water. And the relationship that we have with water is really complex. Maybe I'll just click this, that would be easier. Okay, go away. We use water in lots of different ways. Different cultures use it in different ways. It can be everything from basic sort of human sanitation needs and biological needs to growing food, to cleaning, so washing utensils. The universal solvent, as Don talked about. We use it to provide us food in other ways because of organisms that live in it or grow in it. We also use it extensively for power, some places more than others. It's also sort of a social medium, and it's a place where people gather. To talk a little bit about some water efforts in Africa and Asia, with aid agencies going in to provide individual water spigots to people's houses. And after they finish doing that, the women still walk down to the community well every day because of that. There's a social fabric there that was really important to them that had to do with water but also had to do with their interaction with each other. Transportation, I mean, this could be, I could have put a picture of one of the huge cruise ships on here, but I like this one better. Recreation, some of you I think in here were out doing this yesterday, but recreation in lots of different ways. There's also a really strong historical, cultural connection to water that's reflected in some of the stories that Bonnie talked about and some of those metaphors we've looked at. This is Varanasi in India, one of the older cities in the world. And there's also a really strong spiritual connection with water in most of the major religions. Hinduism is a particular way related to rivers, but certainly baptism in Christianity, evolution in Islam. There's a whole range of things where water plays a really significant spiritual component. And then there's just basic needs of drinking. And there's problems with water, and I'll talk about them a lot. Some of them are human-caused, or economic shortages of water, if you will. Other times, there are just physical shortages of water having to do with what's there in the environment and how many people that choose to live there. There's also a wide range of uses of water that can, in fact, damage or use up that water, and certainly some of those industrial uses are a big part of that. So one of the things with all those different meanings of water, trying to figure out a concept that can hold all of those. A lot of organizations, individuals, scholars, legislators, activists, in some cases just citizens, have latched onto or focused on the idea of water as a human right, as a way, recognizing water as this legal entity, as a human right, as a way to try to encompass those meanings. And, human right has a meaning to all of us. I'm going to talk a lot about it today from a legal perspective, and that's my background, and that's perhaps a narrower perspective than you might come into here. And we could talk, maybe in our small groups, whether, there's a conflict there or whether there's a problem with taking a legal concept and trying to expand it, or vice versa, taking a broad cultural concept and trying to fit it in this little legal box, one of the challenges of disciplines. But in many ways, part of the reason why people are trying to put water in this thing or using this label is because there's a certain amount of power to that legal concept. And you saw that in the Maud Barlow piece that I had you guys read for today. And so citizens groups, governments, water entities, a whole range of people have been talking about water as a human right. And so what I want to do today is just try to answer maybe 5 questions. Is access to a basic amount of safe water a fundamental human right? What would a human right to water look like? Whether it is a human right or not, kind of what would be the dimensions of it? What does it mean that something's a human right? We use that term a lot. What does it mean to lawyers? I'm going to give you an introduction to international law today, to at least get some sense of those concepts. Should we go there? Whether or not it is now recognized as a human right, should it be, and should we be pushing in that direction? What are the advantages or perhaps disadvantages of that? And if so, if it makes sense for it to be a human right, how do we get there from here? So I'm going to try to take you through there in the amount of time we have, and we'll see. So the first question is that is access to a basic amount of safe water a fundamental human right? And one of the first places that I would look to answer that question would be a document that was agreed upon in the United Nations back in 1948 following the travesties of World War II, where the nations of the world came together and said, international law mostly deals with issues between states, but in fact, there's something more fundamental to being human than just what happens between states. Actually, what happens to humans does matter, and what happened in World War II with the genocide and the Nazi concentration camps really is something that, as a globe, we need to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. Out of that came this Universal Declaration. It's not binding law in the sense of like a statute passed in the United States or even a treaty. So in international law, there are 2 ways that international law gets created. One is through something called custom, or sometimes custom and practice, where over long periods of time or because of just universal applications, binding law will be created between nations that limit their behavior, create obligations, and it can be very specific as saying what a territorial sea would be, which was 3 nautical miles under customary law, to things that are a little bit vaguer and perhaps more ambitious, regarding the obligations of one state not to harm the environment of another. But that's real law, that's binding law. The other way that international law often gets created, and the way most of it these days, is through treaties. So in the world of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Rights is seen by many as a way of sort of codifying, of putting down on paper some of those customary laws and saying, particularly the political rights. There are 2 types of rights, and I'll talk a little bit about them maybe later, but there's sort of liberty rights, political rights, and then there's a set of rights that are probably the best term are welfare rights, which have to do with people's welfare, health care, things like that. So the political rights in particular are seen as binding, not because they're written on this document, but because all the nations of the world, at least say they adhere to them. Sometimes nations wander off that path a little bit. Our country's been having some trouble with that over the past few years. But generally, they would say, George Bush would stand up and say, we do not torture. Torture is something prohibited by international law. What we are doing is not torturing. Partially because he recognizes, or at least his State Department recognizes, that there's a binding international commitment there. Whether or not waterboarding is torture or not, that's what lawyers fight about. But the proposition of whether these ideas are binding law is relatively well settled for those political rights. The welfare ones, it's a little bit harder, and that's one of the challenges of international work. So if you look to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25 is probably about the only place in there that you could find a right to water at all, and it's not explicit. What the language says is that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, and housing. So some advocates would say, well, in order to have health and to have food, you need water, so water is implicit in there. But that's kind of a stretch. A treaty that followed from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1966, entered into legal force in 1976, was a treaty called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So 140 some, maybe 150 countries in the world negotiated a treaty, sort of a contract between them, saying that we recognize certain rights as fundamental, certain human rights as fundamental, and give them the status of international law, binding international law. This treaty talks about a whole range of rights, but in Articles 11 and 12, it sort of establishes, or it does establish, a right to an adequate standard of living and human health. It says that's fundamentally a human right. Again, I'll talk later about what that might mean in terms of how it's applied or what obligations it creates. But they came together and said, we believe that that is something that all humans deserve and are legally entitled to. Again, that doesn't say water in it at all. But there's a UN committee it's a panel of experts, so academics, scholars, human rights lawyers, who are recognized throughout the world for their expertise, serve on a committee for the UN that helps interpret this particular treaty, also helps evaluate certain cases that are sort of acts the role of a court, if you will, for some of the claims underneath the treaty. And in 2002, that committee said, okay, the right to water is indispensable for leading a life in human dignity and as a prerequisite for the realization of other human rights. So they said, okay, water, it doesn't say water in there, but how do you have a right of adequate standard of living and human health without water? And therefore, we would interpret this to mean that water is a protected right. The challenge with that is that although they're preeminent experts, it's just an interpretation. The real binding decision on international law is what the countries themselves say is international law and isn't international law. And so it's been sort of contested. In 2007, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's a UN official, had been requested by the Human Rights Council to basically assess this question of human rights, of water, and say, is there a human right of water? And you can see, part of what his finding was, is that he talks a little bit about the human rights treaties with the explicit, meaning clear statements, and implicit, sort of implied obligations in relation to access to safe drinking water and sanitation. Access to safe drinking water and sanitation is not explicitly recognized as a human right, per se, in human rights treaties, which is what I just told you. But it has been acknowledged by 2 expert bodies, as well as by states in several resolutions, declarations, and plans of action. Okay, that's good. So what does that mean? What it means is that the debate's still open as to whether access to safe drinking water and sanitation is a human right from the High Commissioner's perspective in terms of looking at all those documents that are out there and then trying to draw a legal conclusion. Yeah.
I don't understand the argument against it being human right. I understand it doesn't implicitly spell out water, but both documents talk about access to things that you need to survive as being fundamental, and you can't survive without access to clean drinking water. So why should it have to say explicitly? Like, I don't understand the argument against it.
Maud Barlow would agree with you. She would say, well, it's just obvious. I mean, that's like saying there's a human right to air. I mean, there should be a human right to water because without it, none of these other rights could exist. Your right to be free from torture, what good is that if you've died of thirst? That's probably one of those places where a lawyer's perspective might be a little bit different, because the lawyer would look at it and say, okay, these rights exist because either they're recognized by all countries or because we've explicitly said they are. You know, the interpretation part is very, very limited. You can argue, and that's what's going on right now, is you've got lawyers arguing whether it should be implied or shouldn't. And one of the questions, you know, I would ask you is, so how far does that implicate, you know, how far are you willing to imply that? Should health care be an absolute human right? You know, because without health care, then perhaps you can't enjoy these other rights either. And is a job an absolute human right? And the answer to those may be yes, but from a lawyer's perspective, thinking about, okay, once you're on that slippery slope, how fast do you go down the hill is one of the things they're asking. So because of that being sort of contested, the High Commissioner basically said, listen, for lots of good policy reasons, because it seems to be implied in several places, now's the time where the UN should really come out and determine, you know, in the countries of the world, really, come out and determine whether water is a human right. So, you know, why didn't that happen? Why hasn't that happened? It's, you know, part of it is because the language isn't clear. In 1948, water as such wasn't something that the nations of the world were thinking about with the Universal Declaration, and not even so much in 1966. The other reasons why it's contested is because there are people who hold a very different view. And I had you read the Cato Institute piece because I think it's a good articulation of that view, which is that, you know, it may not serve us well to think of water as a human right, and in fact, we don't treat water as a human right. Not only is it not legally, but in practice, we don't necessarily see it that way. The UN deals with a lot of different, both environmental, social issues, some really well, others not so well. Water, interestingly enough, they don't deal with there as much. Back in the 70s, the UN brought together some big international conferences. I think Bartolomei even mentioned some of these. But for a whole host of reasons, it sort of dropped off the table as far as the UN was concerned. And a private group that was made up of NGOs and academics and water business and consultants and sort of the water experts, if you will, of the world, sort of picked up that drop ball because they saw a real need to come together to talk about water issues, to share technology, to, you know, try to define rights in water, and started something called the World Water Forums, which are a multi-stakeholder process that's held every 3 years that considers some of these things. And I'm not going to read everything that's up there. You can read it. But the World Water Forums, in many ways, stepped in where the UN stopped. But it's a very different entity than what the United Nations is. Yeah?
What's the definition of, like, safe drinking water? Because you're reading Bottlemania, and there's all this hype about, like, oh, now it has, like, 1 part per billion of arsenic in it. Oh, dear, we're all going to die. But then, like, in other countries, everyone would probably be, like, ecstatic if they just got, like, human waste out of their water. So, like, what's the...
They might be, depending on what else was left in it, I suppose. I'll try to get to that in a little bit, because establishing that water is a human right and even defining it, still leaves those sorts of questions. And so, without spoiling the end of it, I would say that declaring water as a human right isn't a panacea. It's not going to answer all the questions. And, should, because of other environmental and social forces where lifespans are less, should other countries be satisfied with water that is likely to give them cancer but won't immediately kill them, and rich countries can have a higher standard of safety? I think it's a great question. That'd be a good one to ask in your discussion section tomorrow, because that really raises some real interesting issues about what sort of equity and or fairness provisions are inherent in a human right. But I'll try to answer that a little bit later. I don't know if I will completely. World Water Forums, I actually went to the most recent one in Istanbul this year, bring together a lot of powerful people sort of in the water field, bring together academics, not all of civil society, in that it's a somewhat limited club, if you will. You'll see a lot more men there. You'll see a lot more people in suits. You'll see a lot more people who make money in the water business, maybe providing aid, water aid to poor countries, maybe building big dams. But it's a different sort of gathering than would be like the United Nations climate change conference that's going to happen in Copenhagen. Coming out of Istanbul, they had this question before them of, is water a human right? It's come before World Water Forum several times. And the ministerial statement, and so a ministerial statement is the ministers, so it'd be like the head of in this case, the EPA in the United States. We don't really have a water division or a water bureau in the US per se. Coming all together as, this isn't necessarily an international negotiation, but all the states are represented by their top water person. And they make political statements. They're not binding law, but they help sort of shape the background in which law develops or doesn't develop. And the ministers said, okay, we acknowledge that the discussions within the UN system regarding human rights and access to safe drinking water and sanitation. So that stuff I just showed you before, they said, okay, yeah, we know that's going on. We understand that those issues are up. In fact, we know it's happening here because we evicted some people from this forum who were hanging banners about the right to water and deported them. So we understand it's an issue. But we recognize that access to safe drinking water and sanitation is a basic human need. So they're making a distinction, and again, we can talk about what those semantics may mean, between a need, water is a need, and water is a right. And I'll talk a little bit more about what water is a right means a little bit later. So why did they do that? In part because the World Water Forum is this really mixed group. It's largely sponsored by the World Water Council, which is made up of a lot of the big water companies and some, and academics and engineering firms, people who are concerned about water. And they're not evil. They're not bad people. They legitimately want to see the water, the 1.2 to 1.5 billion people in the world without access to water. They would like to see them provided with water. However, the way in which they would do that and the role in which industry and or government plays is perceived very differently. It's particularly true right now because Loïc Fosson is the head of the World Water Council. His most immediate past job was he was the head of a subsidiary of Suez Water, which is one of the largest water companies in the world. And so, the World Water Forum has a particular perspective, partially because of who they are and what they bring to the table. Just so that you think this isn't sort of a couple of years ago or just in the past, really recently in the Human Rights Council, back in the UN again, I think Spain and Germany actually put forth a resolution to follow up on the High Commissioner's recommendation that, in fact, the UN, through the UN General Assembly, explicitly recognize a human right to water. the US and Canada stripped that from the resolution and instead substituted something so they'd create an independent expert to look at the right to water, which is what's going on right now, is there's an independent expert under the UN looking at whether there's a right to water or not. So just as maybe a stopping point sort of wrap up on that particular question. You know, Maud Barlow says, yes, absolutely there's a right to water. Some other really notable people who I actually respect quite a bit, Peter Gleick and others, have said, yes, there's a legal right to water. There are other people in the world who are saying very loudly, and some of them are in the UN, some of them are in industry, some of them are in various governments, no, there's not a right to water. That water is a need, water is maybe somehow supportive of other human rights, but in fact there is not a legal right to water. And so, standing sort of where I am in 2009, looking around at existing law, international law out there, I think it's pretty hard to say, yes, there's a definitive right to water. That, there may be a moral right to water, and maybe there should be a right to water, and we'll get to that, but that if you were to look at what's out there right now, it's tough to argue that there's this clear international legal obligation. That shouldn't be the end of the discussion, but it's at least a point so that we can move beyond just what's legal. But let's say for a second that there is a right to water. So it starts getting at this question of, so what is it? What would it be if there was such a right? It clearly can't mean that, I should look at my notes sometime, that you can have unlimited access to all the water that you want. I mean, physically, the world can't supply that. We know that. This is a graph that is referred to. It's a UNEP, I think it's a UNEP document, that basically looks at freshwater stress. And the way that it's calculated is, sort of figuring out how much water is there. That one of the articles that you read for Don actually talked a little bit about this methodology, figuring out how much available water there is and just how much of that water is used. The other smaller graph actually looks at population. But in some parts of the world, and in most parts of the world, there really isn't enough water for everybody to have an unlimited supply. So then the question becomes, so what does it look like? Yeah? Yeah, it's not the best map in the world. It's the only one I had access to. So
you're saying most of Africa, the African continent, a big chunk of it has...
They're not taking out very much water right now because really they don't have the infrastructure to do it.
Okay. So that's the same as South America. Okay.
Yeah. There are also water-rich places in Africa, but it's partially what's being used right now, what the stress is. The one down in the corner, but shows a little bit of population and increasing water stress. That's more of a measure of how many cubic liters of water people have available. Yeah, sure. Okay, so the UN High Commissioner, back to that report he did, or it did really, it's because it's a group of people, said, okay, what does the right to water mean? And they say it's the right to equal and non-discriminatory access to a sufficient amount of safe drinking water for personal and domestic uses, drinking, personal sanitation, washing of clothes, food preparation, and personal and household hygiene to sustain life and health. Breaking it out into bullets, accessibility. So there's legal accessibility, meaning that, people can and have a legal right to get water, but also, saying that I have a legal right to water, but I have to walk to Ellsworth to get it, is not accessible under sort of the UN High Commissioner's definition. The question that the quality has to be good enough that it's safe. What does safe mean? Is there a cultural variant? In the United States, if 1 out of 100,000 people get cancer, we see that as not safe, but if it's 1 out of 10,000 in Nigeria, that's okay. There's some real question there. Most of the water advocates in the world would say no, that there should be a similar water quality standard across the globe, but that's certainly contested. Within a range, at this point, having 1 in 1,000 get sick from drinking, probably by any standard, is objectionable. And so there may be some easy, low-lying fruit where we can agree. But so it's got to be safe. The quantity piece, there's a lot written about this, literally entire books. Gleck, who I mentioned before, proposes 50 liters a day as for personal uses. So that doesn't count at all the water necessary for your food. It doesn't count a lot of other water that we consume as humans if we go back to Don's graphs. But just in terms of personal use for those things, he proposes that. Americans significantly more than that, parts of the world significantly less. And an interesting piece that, of course, the lawyers would like, but that's also in this, is some procedural rights, that it's not discriminatory, that there are processes that are inherent in this that would try to ensure the other pieces. What any of those things don't fully answer is, what about sanitation? Is sanitation a co-right with the access to water? Gina Berry, who's a fourth-year student here, will talk about this at great length if you want to know more about this. She's sort of an in-house expert. Next week, Suzanne, I think, will talk a little bit about it. But, a lot more people in the world don't have access to sanitation. Is that a problem? If you want clean water, it's a problem because there's a direct connection between those two things. There are also some other aspects of, it's certainly a gendered issue. There's a lot of questions about dignity. People will talk about water being life, sanitation being dignity. And so this question of, well, if there's a right to water, does that say anything about sanitation? Or is sanitation too big of an order for now? We should just stay clear of it. Other issues that aren't really addressed that hopefully Suzanne may talk about next week is agriculture. Is the right to water, does that include the right to grow crops? Subsistence crops, so supply you and your family? Or does it include the right to grow lots of corn and industrial crops because we need that for food, right? Because we have a right to food, therefore, shouldn't we also have that kind of water? And there's real disagreement on that. There's a proposal for an international treaty recognizing the right of water put out by Green Cross. And you might take I think it's greencross.org. You can look, Google them. It's Mikhail Gorbachev's organization. And they have this proposed treaty, but they actually recognize a right, in their right to water, they recognize the right to agricultural water and also industrial processes because they see that as essential. The other question that doesn't get fully addressed often is whether having something be a right, does that mean that it's free? So if you have a right to water, does that mean that somebody should be just giving you water? And different people have written about that. I mean, oftentimes people who oppose the right to water sort of caricature this. I think the better writing, the better thinking about it, would say no. In fact, a right to water doesn't necessarily mean it's free. That, in fact, water should be paid for either to governments or to private organizations that are supplying that water, but that that should be to recover costs. It shouldn't be to make excess profits beyond that, or those profits should be moderate, would be one of the arguments. The other thing they would argue is that there's a certain group of people, because of emergencies, the victims of Katrina, because of poverty, because of location, that simply can't pay for water, and that in those cases, government should provide water, that there should be some basic allotment. Again, what is that basic allotment is contested, but within that framework, notion that, yes, most of us will pay for water, but not everybody perhaps will pay for it. Giving the government a particular role doesn't necessarily mean, and this is sort of stepping outside of those other commentaries, and so my own thinking about this, that doesn't mean that private industry doesn't have a role in this. And some of the reading, I think Maud Barlow talks about PUPs, which are public-public partnerships. There's also PPPs. So if you do international work, you have to like use initials for everything. You can't use words. You know, PPPs are private-public partnerships. There's a tremendous amount of expertise, technological knowledge, know-how, in some cases efficiency in the private sector that can be brought to bear on the water problems. And to that extent, I agree with the World Water Council and Louis Foucault that, in fact, there's a role for private industry to play. And I don't know if impatience is the right word, but you got a little sense of Maud Barlow's argument, well, human water is a right, it should be only provided by government, government should step up and do it. I don't disagree that government should step up and do it, but I look around the world, and I've been doing, I don't know, water issues probably at this level for like 10 years, and we've been saying that probably for 50 years, and governments aren't stepping up and doing it. And so, you know, to say government should do it and private industry should have no role at all because the government should be doing it doesn't help the kids who are dying of gastrointestinal diseases, doesn't help provide water to families where the young girls have to walk for 8 miles a day to get water and can't go to school, doesn't provide water for their subsistence crops. So I think that that question of how ideological one should be, and there's a very big ideological divide here. For those people on the ground, that's probably not as important as how the water gets there. I can give good examples of privately owned water utilities that are very fair, very efficient, and effective at providing water. I can also give examples, and you guys heard Marcelo Oliveira talk about Cochabamba earlier in this term. Some of you were at that talk, of private entities who were absolutely inept at providing water services, were incredibly unfair, and in fact, hurt the poorest of the poor, but also fundamentally unraveled the social fabric. Same thing on the other side with public things. I can think of some exceptionally good public utilities that provide water broadly, both in the US and elsewhere, and then really horrible, inefficient, corrupt, deficient public utilities. The thing that's troubling internationally, from my perspective, is that there's this presumption by certain institutions, or the global institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, some of the others, that private industry, in fact, is always competent, more efficient, and fairer and a more effective way to deliver water, when in fact they may not be, and just because they're private doesn't guarantee that. That in fact each one of those water contracts is very individual, and that there are a bunch of different pieces to it. There's a public component to it, and there's a private component to it, and thinking about how that contract or how that arrangement is set up so that you can take advantage of the strengths that private industry has. In this case, this is a water treatment facility that's, I don't know, about 10% of the Tigris River flows through there. It's for a city called Diyarbakir in Turkey. That was built by a private company, working in partnership with the city. The city contracts them to run some of the things. The decisions about who gets water, allocations of water rates, things like that, are done by the city. And so there's actually a nice blending of technological expertise and sort of political, taking care of common interests that are done through the political process of the city in this case. And those can work. And so that the notion that you have one or the other seems to me to be a false dichotomy. But when we've got a particular economic model that says only one can work, which is what happens with the IMF and World Bank through something called structural adjustments, where they say, we'll give you money, but you have to do it this way, has led to some real problems, including not only failed water systems and people deprived of water, but an extreme waste of a lot of capital around the world. Okay, let me go back to this thing I keep saying I'm going to talk about. So what does it mean that something's a human right? Internationally speaking, you create obligations by rights, and these obligations rest on the states. And by states, I mean countries in this case. So if there's a human right that exists, then the particular country, if Suzanne is a nation, then the fact that there's this human right, she owes something to her citizens, to the people who live in her country. So those obligations come in three parts, and I think that Maud Barlow actually even mentions this. The first is the obligation to respect. So that would mean that Suzanne wouldn't go out, and if there's this human right that exists, she's not going to do things that interfere with, her people's ability to get water. She's not going to go out and dam the river and cut off all their water supply. Or she's not going to go out and build a factory that pollutes that water so that they can't use it. Or she's not going to go out and suck dry the entire aquifer and sell that water to some other country. Okay, so that initial thing is that she has an obligation, the state has an obligation to not interfere or deprive the people who live in the country of that right. And so it sort of sets limits on what she can do. The second obligation is the obligation to protect. And that's that the state has an obligation to protect that right from third parties. So that when Suzanne, as this country, has a set of laws that govern what goes on inside of her boundaries, and I come in with my oil refinery and I want to build it there, and she says, well, what are you going to do about the effluent from the refinery? And I'm going to say, oh, I'm just going to pump it into the rivers because they flow away and they'll go into the ocean. But I'm bringing you lots of jobs, and if I don't put it in the rivers, then I'm not going to be able to bring those jobs. If there's a human right to water, Suzanne has an obligation to protect the people who use that water. She has an obligation to say to me, no, we want your oil refinery, but you cannot poison the water that people are going to use. Or if you happen to be Nestle, and I'm Nestle, and I come into her and say, I want to suck out this water, and then I want to, export it elsewhere, she might say, okay, you can have some amount of water, but there has to be enough water for the people who live there to have access to water as well, because they have a right to that water. So she has an obligation specifically to protect it from third parties. Mostly, in this case, industry. It could also be another country, I suppose. The last obligation is that obligation to fulfill. And this is the one that makes less developed countries the most nervous, because this actually is an obligation that has an affirmative duty on the country to do something. So in this case, Suzanne actually has to go out and drill wells so that people have access to safe water. It means that she has to put pipelines in, or she may actually have to clean up pollution so that that water can be used. So you see the difference between the different types of obligations, and those can play out in lots of different ways. That last one does, some people ask, well, why do countries in Africa not wholly endorse this human right to water? And that third component is the one that makes them nervous, because that means they have an obligation under international law to make sure that that infrastructure exists, that those pipelines are there, those wells are there, that the pollution's cleaned up, and that costs money. And it doesn't mean the state has to do it all, but it has to ensure that it's done. How that might play out in this sort of water realm is that there's a set of advantages that could come into play. And I don't want to suggest, again, I said this before, but that a right to water is a panacea. Because there's actually, if you look in those same UN documents, there's a right to food, right? And if you look around the world, I don't know the numbers, but I think my best guess is probably a sixth of the population of the world is probably undernourished or more. So, the question is, what good is a right if you can't drink it? right? So you get this paper right, you get an international thing, that the lawyers say, well, that exists, but if it doesn't mean anything real on the ground, what's the point? And with the right to food, that's been an issue. And it was really interesting for me to listen to some of the conversations this weekend because they really mirrored some of the water discussions, even though I would say in the legal documents, the food people are probably like one step ahead. But trying to actually translate that into something on the ground is hard. Why advocates for the right to water still think it's worth doing, though? There are a whole bunch of positives from their perspective. One of them is that it actually creates this framework, that a rights-based approach doesn't just happen at the international level, but actually happens at the local level and the state level and the national level as well. So some of the guys in my section last night went to a hearing in Blue Hill, or a panel presentation, where some of the local communities were talking about a right to water. And so the idea of a right to water has applicability in Freiburg, Maine, or in Bar Harbor, or in Soweto, or in Jaipur, India. But it also has application at the state level, state of Maine, perhaps at the national level, and then I've talked mostly about the international level. It clearly applies there. And so that rights approach, whereas like technical sort of regulations, things like that tend to be very specific to a level and place. It doesn't work at multiple scales. The other thing that citizen groups, NGOs, non-governmental organizations like about a right to water is that they get to play. That individuals and NGOs have some place in this system because rights recognize those individual rights. And therefore, they can use it as a tool to hold their governments responsible. Either as a legal tool, because there are a whole set of legal mechanisms that rights enable you to use, or as a public relations tool. There's the power of human rights in the sort of the court of public opinion is a lot stronger than some of the sort of technical water arguments. I'll talk more about the deplorable state of water management later. The notion of setting water priorities, if there's a human right to water and we make a distinction between personal use, then if given a choice between Suzanne's, big water needs to grow, rice in the desert of California, and my needs to grow, to provide water for just my family and to, water my backyard garden so my family can eat, a human right to water would give some priority there and would say, no, it shouldn't necessarily go to Suzanne, or that there'd be tiered. If there's excess water, then we can grow rice in a desert, but we shouldn't do that up front. That in fact, that 50 liters a day is more important. Other couple things, there are a bunch of human rights institutions. Those of you from Europe actually have mature, developed human rights institutions, a human rights court that is a model in many ways. It actually functions like a court. Individuals can appear before it. It has a tremendous sort of public pressure, but also really works to try to vindicate individual rights. That doesn't exist worldwide, but in that well-developed of a way, but it does exist. There's both the UN system, most of the regions in the world except for Asia have either have human rights commissions or human rights councils, human rights courts. Even Africa, which is sort of a latecomer in that field, has had a couple major environmental decisions coming out of their human rights commissions protecting people's actually right to clean water. In that case, it was with Shell in the Nigerian Delta. So there's some advantages that people see to taking this approach. It also, in many people's mind, creates a different framework because it moves away from water as a commodity, and I'll come back to that in a second. It moves us toward more something that's a common property, something that belongs to the community for which they have a stewardship obligation. And so that instead of water coming to you in trucks in which you pay so much per container, water becomes something that's owned generally, that people have an obligation to protect, that belongs to a watershed that you have some impact on, and that the measures you take, in fact, affect both the availability and the quality of that water. Having a human right to water makes this discussion a little bit easier. A pretty bad caricature, but I like the cartoon. And that it changes the discussion because government has an obligation not to give away certain things to the private sector or to their cronies or to disregard the common rights. And therefore, this funny sort of cycle where you argue, well, we have to privatize water because the public system doesn't work, and well, the public system doesn't work because we privatize certain aspects of it, or we've given capital to those private entities. It's so that this sort of vicious cycle that makes it so that the public system can't work. A right to water would try to shortcut that. A right to water might also affect the way we think about how we treat a river or a water supply. This is a river in Nepal, which is also a drinking water supply for some downstream communities. And that connection is not made at all because the people who can afford it buy bottled water. The people who have the political power to do anything about it buy bottled water. They're not the people who drink that water, the water in this stream. The public education value of reaching out and with the ability to talk to people about water as a human right is something people connect with. They understand. It's an advocacy tool. There's a bunch of great posters that this WASH nonprofit does that tries to convey some of those ideas. But it's something that people understand a lot more than they understand me talking about parts per million of certain chemicals and transboundary water treaties. It also might give the UN some ability, particularly the UN human rights institutions, to go beyond just rhetoric and to actually focus on what having a human right to water could actually mean to people on the ground. So, a couple things, give some time for questions. A human right to water is not a panacea. I've said that about 6 times. But, why that issue has come up, and aside from the political and advocacy advantages to it, there is something about water that's different. And it's really interesting because there's this argument that water should be viewed as an economic good. And therefore, it's like food, shelter, or clothing. They're all necessities. They're all needs, right? And therefore, we should, if we treat them as commodities in the market, the invisible hand of the market will satisfy those needs. There is some truth to that. And that system does work to a point. It's interesting because even among economists, though, they're not sure that that model is a perfect one for water. And economists would argue that, in fact, water is different economically. That it may also not only be a private good, a commodity, but it also could be a public good at the same time. It has this dual nature. And therefore, markets don't do very well with that public good nature. The fact it's very mobile makes it difficult. The fact that it's rather heterogeneous, that it can come in lots of different ways, lots of different spaces, different time, makes it difficult, different than some of the commodities like even food or certainly clothing and shelter. It's complex to cost it. Adam Smith, and I thought about having you read Adam Smith, except that it's really only one paragraph in The Wealth of Nations, talks about pricing and how there's a paradox because diamonds, which in 1776 had very little functional value at all, and we now use them for drills and a bunch of other things, but really had no functional value. They had an aesthetic value, were priceless, and water, which was essential to all life, was essentially so cheap that it was essentially free. And he said that's a really interesting paradox. Most of the pricing of water actually has to do with transporting water, getting water, conveying water, not with the actual cost of water. Water, in fact, is cheaper per gallon in Phoenix, Arizona than it is here, which is kind of ironic. The other piece, leaving the economists aside for a minute, but I figure if economists say water is different, then that says something. But water is also perceived differently. And whether policymakers like that or not, it is. That's part of why this whole notion of a water justice movement has caught on, is because people really do see water as life. And so, recognizing that it has vital social, cultural, ecological roles that aren't protected by pure market forces has, created a lot of resistance to moving water from kind of the social realm into the market realm. Where social realm you have social rules that apply, market realm you have markets. There's saying, well, this doesn't really fit because these other values get left off. That if you use just economic pricing as the only way to allocate water, that in fact things fall off the table. And that inherent in all commodification is inequality, right? That he who can pay gets it, she who can't pay doesn't get it, right? That's how markets work. And so if water is more than just a commodity, if it has these other values, then how do you make those things come together? It also ignores sort of the life support function. And there's even people in the water justice movement that really talk about just allocating water to individuals when there's a whole ecosystem out there that actually needs some piece of that. And markets, trees don't vote with their pocketbook very well. They don't vote politically very well either, but particularly they're not very good consumers. Neither are rocks or fish or other things that need water. So how you bring them into a system that's a market-based system is particularly challenging. So Maud Barlow talked a little bit, Bottlemania talked a little bit about this notion of thinking of water in a different way. And one of the ways that they suggest we think about water is as a public trust. And I sent some of the core course instructors a case that let it be optional if they want to send it out to you or if you want to read it, that talked about the notion of a public trust and what that is. But just really quickly, public trust, the idea behind a public trust is that the government has a different role regarding the obligations that it owes its citizenry. And that you can sort of think, because I use an economic model here, but it works. If you think about a government as being sort of a bank or a trustee that sort of holds something that belongs to you and keeps it for you, keeps your interests in mind, you're the beneficiary of that. They can invest it, they can do various things about it, but everything they do has to be to serve your interests. They can loan it out to others who then build houses or everything else, but at some point you have to be able to reclaim that money with additional interest in it. That they don't own the money, they don't get to give it away to Nestle, they don't get to give it away to their political crony friends, they don't get to give it away at all because it doesn't belong to them. That in fact, their only role is to act as a trustee. And that as a trustee, they can let people use it, and they need to let people use it because water is really important economically, but that in fact, you can't do things that alienate a person, perpetually, you can't forever give it away, you can't forever separate it, that in fact, the citizens as a whole are the ones who own it. And the public trust doctrine has been applied, like in Maine, the reason why the shore, the waters in Maine, the lakes in Maine have public access has to do with the public trust doctrine. The public trust, this notion of ownership, the state of Maine cannot give away the bottom of Frenchman's Bay. They don't have that power. They can lease it, they can let people use it, they can let boats go over it, but they cannot give it away. Same thing with Eagle Lake. That belongs to the people of Maine as a whole. The town of Bar Harbor, the state of Maine cannot give that. They cannot sell that away. It has to forever remain with people. Groundwater in Maine, much to the chagrin of the people in Freiburg, does not have that same principle, at least as not as in current Maine law. There isn't a public trust that extends to groundwater. Surface waters have that protection, groundwaters don't, which is one of the reasons why Maine's really attractive for bottling companies, because they can get that water out relatively easily, because if they own the surface, they can pump whatever they want from underneath. There are other ways that we can move beyond just the public trust doctrine. And a lot of those involve some of the water democracy movements, water justice movements that are happening worldwide, where people are coming back and saying, water's life, don't take it away. Some of that's against privatization, some of it has to do with pollution, some of it has to do with dams, some of it has to do with agriculture. This is a farmers union march. It's happening in lots of different dimensions, but it's in part a reaction to globalization, but also a reaction to real physical changes on the ground, sometimes caused by globalization, sometimes caused by other things. As climate change occurs, what will happen in terms of water availability overall is disputed. The access to water, the timing of water, however, will change. So if you lose the glaciers in the Himalayas or in the Sierras, agriculture has a problem because water's going to come at the wrong time all at once. If you change climatic patterns so that you have a lot of flooding in an area that's very heavily developed, again, you're going to have some real problems. So we may have more water with climate change, but maybe less usable water in many ways. There's stuff going on internationally. This is actually a picture, not that you can clearly see it because it's so dark, of COA student reading a statement at the World Water Forum to the plenary session in front of all the ministers and all the water executives on behalf of youth, saying, from youth's perspective, water is a right, not a commodity, and that they need that, that needs to be enshrined in international documents from the top as well as from the bottom. There's other work that's happening internationally. The real work to try to create an international treaty has been going on in several places. I mentioned Gorbachev's efforts. There's 2 or 3 other places. Even Congress, there was a resolution in Congress to recognize the right to water as a human right. Probably within your lifetime, I would expect that there will be a treaty that recognizes the human right to water. What the details will be, that's the big battleground. I mean, I think that there's been enough movement and there's seen as either enough value or enough political weight behind the idea that it's going to happen. What it looks like, does it include large-scale agriculture? Does it have real safety measures? Does it have teeth? Those are all up in the air. There's also a lot going on at the lower level, whether at the political level. Uruguay recently, by referendum, put a right to water in their constitution. South Africa has a right to water. Ecuador recently recognized the right to water. France, which is sort of interesting through legislation, recognizes the right to water because France has some of the bigger water companies in the world. That's happened in several places, so people aren't waiting for the international level to sort of get it together. But also at the local level, there's tremendous movements around the world. This is a picture of Rajendra Singh, who is called the Rain Man of India. He works in Rajasthan. He's sort of single-handedly and with really no technical expertise has brought all these communities in Rajasthan, which is in western India, very deserty, to sort of reclaim traditional water harvesting techniques and have done amazing things in terms of making water available within those communities, drawing on what had been traditional community-based governance structures and technologies to do that. So with very low technology, very low foreign aid, in fact, no foreign aid, has been able to provide water at this local level and change sort of the concept of water, again, being a community right, not something you buy in a bottle, not something you own, but something that the community itself possesses. That's happening across, I mean, whether you're thinking about people fighting the dams in the Narmada, people in Freiburg who are fighting Nestle, across the country and around the world, groups are doing that sort of work This is a picture of somebody from the Save the Ganges campaign. You know, a river that drains the waste of probably 750 million people. The Ganges has some severe pollution problems by any standard. You know, when I said what's in here, one answer could have been an incredibly concentrated brew of pathogens. You know, the bacteria count in the Ganges, I went out and did water quality monitoring with them, is 40,000 times the legal limit in the United States. So, which is a little stunning. And before we went out in the morning, everybody who went out bathed in it as part of the ritual, which was a little bit hard to watch. But anyway, we can talk about that later. That group, however, really believes that they can clean up the Ganges. And they're doing it town by town, temple by temple, person by person. They did a river cleanup last year and got, you know, 15,000 people out in this one town picking up trash. There are more people in India to work with, but still, there's efforts to do that. We're doing that locally. There's a Carbrook cleanup, a little different than cleaning up the Ganges. This Saturday, shameless advertisement, you know, this little brook in Ellsworth that's abused, that flows down to the Union River. You know, people in the community are going out there and acting as stewards of it. And in some ways, part of that effort, the Union River Watershed Coalition does all this water quality monitoring, does a lot of other work, community work, some scientific work, historical work, planning work. But what they're really trying to do is change the way people think about the river and the water that's around them. Most of that work's done through one-on-one, talking to people in those communities as part of building the community at the same time that you change that mindset. So I have two last images that I just want to leave you with. This first one is of a silver vessel. I'm sure it actually has a real name, but I can't remember what it is. It's about 6 feet high, you know, probably 5 foot in diameter, maybe a little bit bigger. It belonged to the Maharaja of Rajasthan, so that when he traveled, he took this with him. It contained Ganges river water, sacred water, that he took with him in his travels. It's like, you know, it's sort of the ultimate in bottled water, okay? You know, you take this thing with you in your travels, you know, 400, 500 years ago. And there are modern Maharajas that have that ability to take safe water with them wherever they go, or to bring it into their communities. And the right to water at some fundamental level isn't really so much about them, because they're are going to be able to get that water. Where the cutoff is may vary, but that water is going to be available. The ones that I'm more concerned about and that the right to water really addresses are those that sort of fall below that line, and the next generation of those people that are below that line, that are the children who, you know, aren't in places where they can afford bottled water, where they don't have a set of choices, and that, in fact, you know, the common right that they have is being despoiled by a whole set of actions for which they have no control over whatsoever. And so I want to leave you with that, recognizing that we've got some time for questions, and that you'll be able to discuss this a little bit more tomorrow in your discussion groups. Thanks. So questions? Really was shy? Yeah.
Hey, I had a question when you were talking about kind of if water is defined as a human right, then kind of what part of what goes along with that is the need to protect that right. Mm-hmm. But last night at the phone thing, they were kind of discussing like the NAFTA, how corporations are treated as individuals with rights to trade, and how they could sometimes sue if they felt those rights were being violated. So what happens when another right conflicts with the right, like the right to water? How does that get resolved?
Probably depending on who you ask. Some would say that human rights should have some hierarchy, should give priority over economic rights. I mean, in part, you've got two incompatible systems in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the challenges that probably your generation faces as much as anybody before, because the clarity of that conflict has been pretty well laid out sort of post, the WTO battle in Seattle. And that there is a sort of a world order that suggests that those economic rights and privileging those economic rights, in fact, will trickle down and will take care of all these other interests. And really believe that. I don't want to portray those as sort of evil people at the WTO who are trying to destroy the world for everybody else. They really believe that that system will in fact benefit everyone. And there are some models that suggest that might be right. I mean, the United States has some of that because we're a free trade zone. That opening up trade may benefit some people. But that conflicts very dramatically with something that's focused on, that doesn't play by the same rules, that looks at common ownership, which the WTO and NAFTA, things like that, really can't really conceive of, actually. It's like looking at two different incompatible cultures. Common ownership, community level decisions, self-determination, and democracy. I mean, one of the challenges with the Bretton Woods organizations is that they're inherently undemocratic. And so there's a conflict there. And I think that you see that played out sometimes violently. In Cochabamba, I mean, it really was violent. People were killed. You see it played out subtly in other places. But there's systems that aren't particularly compatible. I think one of our challenges, actually as human ecologists, is to look for ways that maybe there's some new system or some hybrid that actually could work, or to try to help people rethink the assumptions that lead them to one extreme or the other. But I think it's really hard, honestly. If you buy into that one model, and if you think NAFTA and sort of economic rights and supremacy is dominant, then taking water from Mount Desert Island, putting it in a big rubber condom thing, and towing it on a boat to Saudi Arabia makes perfect sense, because water is more valuable in Saudi Arabia than it is in Maine, right? I mean, and that's, that. If that's all you value, then that's a perfect thing to do. That's not a very satisfying answer. Sorry, Richard. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that Uruguay made water a human right in the Constitution. Has anything changed as far as infrastructure goes in fulfilling that right?
Some. And for human rights, water activists not fast enough. There have been some changes, and there's been at least one lawsuit that's been brought to push more. So I think it was 2004 maybe? I should know, maybe 2006. So it's relatively recent. It's not ideal. One of the things some of you who were at the Cochabamba talk heard talk a little bit about, once the public took back over the water system, it's not been like peaches and cream. That in fact, they're having problems with management and a bunch of other issues as well. And partially because the governance structures for how those human rights are protected are not very transparent. The other place where it's been interesting is South Africa, and when they ended apartheid and Nelson Mandela came into office, they rewrote the Constitution. South Africa actually adopted water as a human right as well, though the provisions of it didn't specify at all in terms of how that would be delivered or executed, or how it would be implemented. South Africa has chosen to privatize a lot of their water, and it's been incredibly contentious there, with both lawsuits and protests saying, no, metering water in the poorest communities deprives people of their human right. The government of South Africa's response was then to say, okay, you're right, we can't just charge everyone for water, we can provide a basic amount of water for everyone and then charge over that. But they still haven't really gotten the details down. So how they do that is technically difficult. And so the implementation has been challenging. Ecuador would be really interesting to watch and see how it plays out. There are some places that don't recognize water as a human right, but put in procedural safeguards. Great Britain refuses to recognize water as a human right, fights against it in all the international forum. But in Great Britain, the water companies that are now private cannot cut off your water because that's just not a proper thing to do. So, it's interesting because there's some of those concepts that come with the human right to water that you could build into a process without even absolutely recognizing the right. It's harder, doesn't give any legal standing to do it. And if you don't change some fundamental infrastructure and governance, just having the right may not be enough. So ask me that question in 5 years and maybe I'll give you a better answer about Uruguay. But from talking to people there, they feel like there's been a whole set of reforms that's gone with it, and things are better, but it's still, reversing, 100 years of something different. Other question? Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit more the reasoning behind opposition to water as human right? What are they saying? Why it shouldn't?
Why it shouldn't be?
Yeah.
So, some of the stuff that the Cato Institute raises, I think gives you some of those arguments, but I'm going to sort of stretch beyond that. I think that some people would say that recognizing it as a human right, that human rights should be political rights more than anything else, not these welfare rights. That, one of the rights in the Declaration of Human Rights, let's say this for John's sake, is a right to paid holidays. That'd be great. I wish we had paid holidays at the college. Is that the same as the right to be free from torture? No, it's not. So talking about water as a right, something you can buy versus the ability to have free speech or to be free of torture or to be free of genocide, that they say, water is important, sure, but that just waters down the essence of human rights. If you really care about human rights, let's talk about the real human rights, which are these political things, and the welfare rights. Those are important, but kind of secondarily. And if you try to put them all together, what you're going to end up doing is saying, oh yeah, right to holiday, right to water, right free from torture. Yeah, those are all the same, right? I don't think you have to go there, but that's one of the arguments. Another argument for lesser developed countries in particular is saying, we don't want this to be a human right because that creates an obligation we cannot fulfill. We would like to not have our children dying of dysentery, honestly. Given the choices. But we do not have the infrastructure. We have tremendous debt to some of those Bretton Woods institutions, and that we have to pay back. We don't have the economies because of the world trade system that's literally stripped us of our traditional economies. We could not do this. And creating a right that we couldn't fulfill both exposes us to ridicule and undermining by our citizens, and also makes us violate international law. And we really don't want to do that. Those, I think, are two of the, for me, probably two of the more persuasive arguments. And so, there are answers to both of them, but I think that they, stand out there. Then the other issue is, the question of, well, water is something, I got it. I bought this, or I guess I stole it from the college. But anyway, I've got this thing, the water, they paid for it. Water as a commodity sort of works for most of us. So, why mess up the system by making it a human right and making it all messy when we can just treat it like we do food and clothing and cars and anything else? There may be some other ones. Actually, some people in my class, I assign them the task of finding good arguments against it being a human right. So they may have others, but. Any last questions?
I think the role for water reserve houses and for standpoint of water as a human right, are they for or against? Is there big companies in there and everything, and during these meetings, what do people why do they meet kind of thing?
Why do they meet?
Do they try to agree on it, or are they denying it? Or
they try to, they have agreed that it's not. So, I mean, it's interesting because it's a mixed bag, because when these groups first came together, it said water is important, water management's important, we need to provide water to the world. The Millennium Development Goals, does everybody know what those are? Yeah, the notion that we're going to cut the number of people without access to water in the world by 50% by the year 2015. And we made some progress toward that. Sanitation, not at all. But you know, there's been some progress toward that. And the World Water Council, people at those meetings are committed to that. And it's a really eclectic group. I mean, there are people there who've spent their lives installing pit toilets in Africa next to, you know, executives who get paid, you know, with bonuses $2 million a year to, you know, go around gobbling up, you know, water supplies and selling it. So it's a really interesting mixture. Where they've come together is this sort of commitment that we need to address water, and that needs global attention. The particular approach that they take is very different. And the World Water Forums and all their declarations have never gone to saying that water is a right. In fact, they've specifically rejected that and have come out with that language that water is a need. And so, but it is on their agenda, and to their credit, you know, they let people like me go to their forums. So there's some attempt at opening up that dialogue, but it's very controlled. Whereas at the UN, you know, or public, you know, conferences, you know, negotiations, that process is very open. You know, the World Water Forum is much more closed, but it's less closed than it used to be. And so, you know, maybe it'll move. It's 4, so if people have any additional questions, you know, I'll be here for a bit. Come ask me questions.